ye sinners poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore, Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power.
Welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. First of all, let me wish all of you a very prosperous new year. And when I'm wishing for your prosperity, I'm really wishing for our spiritual prosperity. We need that far more than we need physical and material prosperity. We need for God to revive His church again so that His people will rejoice in Him. We have come to a day in which people are, without any compunction whatsoever, willfully misrepresenting the character of God and speaking blasphemous things against Him. And they think they're counteracting the whole idea of God's sovereignty and salvation and what we as those who are soteriological monarchists believe. But in reality, they are speaking against the God of Scripture, because God has very clearly revealed that He is the one who has determined what is going to happen in His world. If you really read the Scriptures, and one of my fears is that most of these folks have never read the Scriptures, and most of these folks have never even heard a pastor expounding the Scriptures as they are clearly revealed. I've been to many, many churches where the pastor will take a text and go everywhere except for the text, preaching the gospel. Our task is to go to the Word of God and to explain what God has revealed. We are not to take a text and then begin to expound our ideas. And yet that's what happens in many of these churches. And so I think there are thousands upon thousands of people who have been starved spiritually. I've often been counseled to put the cookies on the lower shelf. The problem is, if we put the cookies on the lower shelf and that's all we do, the whole church is going to die of malnutrition. We have to do more than put the cookies on the lower shelf. We have to make people reach for truth. We have to challenge people to believe what God has revealed in His Word. If you take text out of context and use them as a pretext, you're never going to do that. And so our prayer is that God will revive His church, that His people might rejoice in Him as He has revealed Himself in the Scriptures. One of the questions that I have, and I've been involved in many, many online discussions, one of my questions is, how many times do you have to tell a person, this is not what I believe, what I do believe is such and such, before they will begin to believe what you're saying and understand that what they are accusing you of is really not what you believe. Of course, the classic line that I continue to see on many of these YouTube conversations is, well, you Calvinists always say that we have misrepresented your views. And the reason we Calvinists say you have misrepresented our views is because you have misrepresented our views. One of the chief offenders here is a man named Dr. Leighton Flowers. He claims to have been a Calvinist at one time. Some of you have heard what he has to say. And yet he seems to have no understanding whatsoever about what Calvinists believe. Now, my conclusion has to be that either he is too obtuse, that's one of my favorite words, he is either too obtuse to understand what Calvinists believe, or he is deliberately misrepresenting, lying, what Calvinists believe and what he knows we believe. I can't think of any other alternative, because what he is saying that we believe is not what we believe at all. There is a quote that he has from supposedly from Calvin's treatise on the eternal predestination of God, and I would strongly suggest that you make your way through that. Some really, really good material there. But he has this quotation, and he's, I think, taken it completely out of context, and he uses it on his Soteriology 101 website, and he ignores everything else that Calvin has to say. Because God, as Calvin talks about, God not only determining to cause certain things, but also determining to permit certain things. The distinction between what we believe concerning permission, God's permission of things, and what the Arminian or the provisionist would mean by that is they believe that he is the cosmic observer, and he is looking on, and he is just letting things happen to no end or purpose. And what we believe is, yes, God has permitted certain things. He doesn't cause everything that he has determined will come to pass, but he has determined to permit them because he has a good and holy purpose for them. And I want to talk a little bit about that. One of the accusations that we quite often hear from some of these folks is that if God is what the Calvinist represents him to be, then God is an evil tyrant who is causing people to sin. And so I want to talk a little bit about that whole idea. If God has predestined the sinful actions of wicked people, does that mean that God is evil himself? Now, granted, there are Calvinists who have written in the past that God causes everything that happens in his world. That is, by his decree. And our question would be, are they talking about proximate cause, or are they talking about ultimate cause? We have to make that distinction. And in Calvin's treatise on the eternal predestination of God, he often makes that very distinction between what would never have happened had God not determined that it would happen, and what God has determined to permit to happen. I'd like to read to you, if I can find it here, from Jonathan Edwards. He's talking about the decree of God, and this is what he has to say. He's talking about those who deny that God has decreed all things that come to pass. And he says this: whether God has decreed all things that ever come to pass or not, all that own the being of God own that he knows all things beforehand. Now, we have those in our day who are called open theist, or the openness of God theology types, and they will say, no, God doesn't know everything, but all who own the being of God and all who know what the Scriptures actually teach, and not what these people have concocted in their little brains, all that own the being of a God own that he knows all things beforehand. Now it is self-evident, says Edwards, that if he knows all things beforehand, he either approves of them, and I'm modernizing this, he either approves of them or he doesn't approve of them. That is, he is either willing that they should be, or he is not willing that they should be. But to will that they should be is to decree them. If you have to go back and listen to that again, I suggest that you do that, because it's a very, very important statement. You can deny that God decrees all things all you like, but in reality, if God, knowing everything that would happen in his world, if he created, proceeded with creation, then he obviously approved that what he knew would happen if he created was going to happen. And if God approved that they were going to happen, then in reality he determined that they were going to happen. Now that it may involve determining to permit them to occur, or it may involve determining to cause them. There are some things that God restrains, that he has decreed to restrain. There are some things that God permits that he hates, and he has determined to permit them. You see, it's only logical that if God permits them, he must have decided to do so. He doesn't just let things run helter-skelter without any rhyme or reason and without any purpose. If God has determined what is going to happen, then it's going to happen. And so in that sense, there is fixity, there is certainty. Nothing that God has determined that he will permit is not going to happen. And nothing that God has determined that he is going to cause is going to fail to happen. Everything that God has decreed will occur. And if what God has determined to permit occurs because sinful creatures do what they wish to do and freely wish to do, then God is not to blame for their sinful actions, even though he has predestined those sinful actions in the sense of determining to permit them. I hope that's clear to you. If not, you have the comment section. Feel free to leave something in the comment section, a question, comment, whatever. One of my regrets is that there are so few people who are actually opposing our view, who actually come to the channel and listen. But perhaps you can use some of these arguments on your friends, and maybe they will be convinced of biblical truth. Often we're told that when Calvinists say that God is sovereign, what we mean is that God has causally determined everything that happens in his universe so that he treats us like robots or puppets, and he pulls the strings and he causes us to do what we do, and we have no choice in the matter whatsoever. We just do because God pulls the strings. One of the things my wife likes to say, and rightly so, is that if God were the one pulling our strings and we had no choice, then we would never sin. We would always act in a holy manner, because God, being holy and pulling the strings, would never cause us to sin. And I think that's an accurate statement. Calvinists have confessionally and categorically denied that God is the author of sin, or that he has any joint participation with any in it. That when he has decreed what he has decreed, he does so in a way that he has done no violence to the will of the creature. In other words, creatures, human beings, act willingly and many times culpably in executing the decree of God. And then we are told that God uses second causes. In other words, he is not the one who is the proximate cause of sin, but he uses second causes to accomplish his purpose. And so, when we talk about the sovereignty of God, we're not saying that God has meticulously and causally determined everything that's going to happen, so he treats us like robots or puppets, and then meticulously causes us to do everything that we do, whether it's sinful or not, and then turns around and judges us for doing it. And yet that's the way our view is misrepresented. Sometimes I wonder how many times you have to tell a person, I'm sorry, but that is not what we believe, before they begin to understand that that isn't what we believe. My friend John Riesinger, who's now with the Lord, used to say in a debate, the very first rule ought to be, I will not answer your question or respond to what you've had to say until you state my view to my satisfaction. And once you have stated my view to my satisfaction, then and only then will I respond to it. The problem with the debate that is going on in our day is that people almost never represent our view to our satisfaction. If you want to argue with us, argue with what we actually believe. Don't argue with the straw dummy that you are claiming that we believe. Charles Spurgeon says, what a wonderful deed has been done by some men in burning figures of their own stuffing. How earnestly do they set themselves to confute what no one defends. And I think that's exactly what's going on in our day. Now, what do we mean when we talk about the sovereignty of God? This is in response to the misrepresentation that what we mean is that God treats us like robots or puppets. What do we mean? Well, I think one of the answers that we ought to give is found in Chronicles chapter 29, verses 11 and 12. You remember that there had been an offering collected to rebuild to build the temple, and the people had been quite willing and responded quite well to the request that they bring their resources and their money to contribute to building the temple. And David is responding to that wonderful free will offering. That is, it was a voluntary offering. It wasn't something that God had commanded them. It was something that he called upon them to do voluntarily, and they had responded very generously. And David is thanking God for that. And this is what he says in verse 11 of 1 Chronicles 29. This is what we mean when we talk about the sovereignty of God. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory, the victory and the majesty, for all that is in heaven and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head over all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you reign over all. That's what we mean when we talk about the sovereignty of God. God is the supreme ruler of the universe. He is the King of Kings, the only potentate, the King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords, according to 1 Timothy chapter 6. King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what we mean when we talk about the sovereignty of God. Now, here's the question that I want to talk to you about for just a few minutes. And we're not going to draw this out very long, but we are told that if God has intended or determined the actions of wicked people, then God himself must be evil. Now, what I want you to do, and I want to talk about just two passages, I want you to think about the account of Joseph and his interaction with his brothers and with his father. If you're not acquainted with that story, I would encourage you to go back to the book of Genesis and read about Joseph and how he was just a trifle cocky, and his brothers were jealous of him, and his father sort of showed favoritism toward him and made him a coat of many parts. And Joseph says, "Look here, what Dad did for me. Too bad he didn't do it for you. And then I had this dream, and you guys were all bowing down to me." And indeed, that actually happened. And so they were jealous. And so they said, "We got to get rid of this kid." And so they threw him in a pit. They put blood all over his coat that his father had made for him. And ultimately, they sold him into slavery down into Egypt. And then they went and they lied to the father and so forth. Now, all of their actions were sinful actions, mind you. All right? They acted wickedly toward him. And to make a long story short, there was a famine in the land. They came down to Egypt to get food. Joseph had been exalted to a place of power in the Egyptian kingdom. And he had the ability to supply their needs so that they would not starve to death in the famine. And they recognized him, and they were trembling in their boots. And as they were standing before him, he said, "Am I in the place of God?" This is found in Genesis 50. Am I in the place of God? And then in verse 20, he said this to them, "As for you," and I can imagine that he was thinking, "As for you, you sorry scoundrels, as for you, you intended evil against me." Okay? So what he is saying there is that not only were there intentions, but the actions that flowed from those intentions were evil actions. Okay? They were guilty of sinning according to their evil intentions. All right, that's the first part of the verse. "As for you, you intended evil against me, but God," same word, intended it for good. Intended what for good? Intended your evil intentions for good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now, does that mean that God caused any of their evil intentions? And the answer is, of course not. God cannot be allured to commit evil, and he does not allure anyone to sin or to commit evil, according to the book of James. And so we have to dismiss that out of hand. God does not cause anyone, God does not even tempt anyone to commit evil actions. And so no, their actions were their own, and their own alone. All right, they had evil intentions. But then Joseph said, those very evil intentions that you had against me, God intended for good. In other words, God determined to use those actions to accomplish his good purpose. And so this is what you have to ask yourself. If God intending or decreeing evil actions means that God himself is evil, then do you not have to conclude that God is evil based on that verse? The premise is that if God has predestined sinful actions, then one, he must be the proximate cause of those actions. And if that is the case, then he must be evil himself. That's the way our friends, the provisionists and others, seem to reason. If God has intended those things to happen, then he must cause them to happen. Is that what we believe? No. We do not believe that. He is not the proximate cause of evil. If God has intended the evil actions of wicked people, does that mean that God himself is evil? And if it does, then you must conclude based on this verse, since the actions that God intended, the actions of the brothers, you must conclude that God himself is evil for intending those actions for a good purpose. That's what you have to believe, if you believe what you believe. Let me give you another verse, or another couple of verses. You remember the early church was being persecuted, and I'm thinking here about Acts chapter 4. If you have a Bible in front of you, you might want to turn to that passage. The early church was being persecuted, and they, being released, went to their own company, and they began to pray, and they remembered Psalm 2. Wonderful, wonderful psalm. Why do the heathen, why do the nations rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves against Yahweh and against his anointed one, saying, let us break their bands asunder. Let us cast away their cords from us. Was that not exactly what the wicked Jews of Jesus' day were doing in crucifying him? Let us break their bands asunder. Let us cast away their cords from us. And then the psalm goes on to say, he that sits in heaven shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. And the early church said this of a truth. Against your holy servant Jesus, whom you have appointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do what? Whatever your hand and your purpose determined beforehand to be done. We could translate that, to do what your hand and your purpose predestined to be done, or decreed to be done. Does that mean that God caused the sinful actions of Herod or Pilate or the Gentiles or the people of Israel or Judas? Remember back in chapter 2 of Acts in verse 23, Peter on the day of Pentecost had stood up and said, him being delivered by what? The determinate counsel, the determinate will, and foreknowledge of God, you have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. I can just imagine that when they heard those words, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, they must have said, "Whew, we thought we were guilty of that." And then Peter said, "You have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain." One of my favorite Puritans, Thomas Watson, said it this way: God has a hand in the action where sin is, but never in the sin of the action. I want you to meditate on that just a little bit. God has a hand in the action where sin is, but never in the sin of the action. God uses second causes to accomplish his purpose. God is never the proximate cause. Now, is there anything that ever occurs in God's world that can occur either by permission or by cause that would have happened had God not either determined to permit it or to cause it? And the answer is no. God is the prime mover, and nothing happens in his world that God has not intended to happen. But that doesn't mean that God causes as the proximate cause. And so if someone talks about God causing sin, then what they're probably talking about, if they really understand the doctrines of Calvinism, what they're really saying is God is the ultimate, the prime mover. He's the reason that everything happens, because whether he permits it to occur or whether he causes it himself, it would never have occurred as the but-for clause, if you will, but for the sovereignty of God and his eternal decree, these things would never have happened. But he is never the proximate cause of these things, because he uses second causes and sinful causes to accomplish his purpose. I know this probably isn't the easiest thing to comprehend, but it is precisely what the Scriptures teach and what Calvinists have confessionally declared through the centuries. And if you say, no, that can't be what you believe, then you simply don't understand what Calvinists have always claimed to believe. And so here's the question again. Does what we read in Acts 4, verses 27 and 28, mean that God is the proximate cause of the evil actions of Herod or Pontius Pilate or the Gentiles or the people of Israel or of Judas? Did God cause them to do what they did, or did they do so freely, willingly, and sinfully and culpably? And of course the answer is no, God is not the proximate cause of that. But if you assert that if God predestines sinful actions, then God must be evil, then the only conclusion you can draw from this passage is that God must be evil, because the text clearly says, I'm not reading anything into the text, the text clearly says that God has determined beforehand what these wicked people did. It happened by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. You have taken, you're at fault, you're responsible, you're going to be judged for it, but you're doing it because God has determined to permit it, because he has a good purpose for it. I hope you'll spend time meditating on these things, because they're worth understanding. Not one of us who really believes what the Scripture has to say about God and his sovereign providence believes that God must cause the wicked actions of sinful people. We simply don't believe that. And yet that is imputed to us time after time after time. Anyone who tells you that is either completely confused or they're lying to you. That simply isn't the truth. And it's time that we call a spade and acknowledge that there are people on the other side of the fence from us theologically who are deliberately lying about our view because they want to have some sort of advantage. I'm not going to share with you right now what I think they're trying to do, but there's a song that was done years ago by Dan McBride about the Southern Baptist, and the song goes something like this. I'm climbing destiny's ladder with the self-improvement plan. I'm a guy who loves and pursues the way that seemeth right to man. It's a tradition, it's a thing that tradition gave us, and I'm sure that you'll agree that it must be the will of the Lord because it seems so right to me. And that seems to be what's motivating a lot of these people. Let's see what we can do to boost ourselves and give us a higher position and get people to know us and all the rest of that mess. Think a little bit. That's all I'm asking you to do. If you believe that if God has determined sinful actions, in the text that I've given you, both texts, and there are others, but the text that I've given you very clearly tell us that what these wicked people did was God's intention because he had a good purpose for it, then you have to conclude that God is evil if you believe that if God has decreed all things, God is evil, or if God has decreed evil actions, then God is evil, then God must be evil. Can you think of any other alternative? I don't think so. And so, just think about what I'm talking about, and then you might want to ask your friends, how do you deal with passages like this? And I know one of the answers. Well, yeah, those are exceptions. God, there are some things that God has determined. But that doesn't mean God has determined everything. And I don't know how you deal with Ephesians 1:11 that says he is the God who is effectively accomplishing. Look up the word works if you don't believe what I'm saying here, because that's exactly what the word means. It's the word from which we get our word energy. God is the one who is effectively accomplishing how many things? All. According to the counsel of his will. God is accomplishing all. But let's just go back to the idea. These are exceptions. Yeah, it says that God intended the actions of Joseph's brothers, but that doesn't mean that God has intended everything or to permit everything that is evil. And so that doesn't, he just did it once or twice. You got it in that passage and over here in Acts. And so that does, he just did it once or twice. That doesn't make him evil. And so my question is, how many times do you have to commit murder before you become a murderer? If God only did it once, and decreeing evil actions of wicked people makes God evil, does that not have to mean that God is evil, even if he only did it once? And I think the answer that you have to come to is absolutely. Absolutely. But you see, that's not what we believe. And so if anyone is watching this video who has any connection whatsoever with those on the other side, I realize that almost never does anyone come to watch these videos who would disagree with what I'm having, or who would agree with what I'm having to say. They would all disagree with it. They just don't come watch. I don't get any comments from any of them. So if you know someone, ask them the question. I'd like to hear the answer. And again, I want to put maybe a quote or two from John Calvin and his treatise on the eternal predestination of God in the description below, so that you can see what Calvin actually taught. So if you have questions or comments or objections to anything I've had to say, I will welcome them. I know there are some who are on YouTube who are quite orthodox and teach really good truth, but they have given no opportunity for people on YouTube, at least, to respond to what they have to say. I want to hear what you have to say. I'll answer you. If you make good points, I'll let you know that I think you're making good points. I'm reminded of a story. There was a guy named Uncle Verdi Ledbetter, and he was out coon hunting one night, and there was a coon up a tree, and he couldn't quite get a shot at it, so he decided to climb the tree, and what he thought was a coon turned out to be a lynx, and this thing was just ripping the hide off of him. And he said to his friends, he said, "Shoot up in here and kill him." And they said, "Verdi, we're afraid we'll shoot you." He said, "Go ahead and shoot, because one of us has got to get some relief." And somehow, when I argue with some of these folks, that's exactly how I feel. Go ahead and shoot up in here, because one of us has got to get some relief. So if you have friends, share these things with them, ask them the question, invite them to come and state their views, and I'll be happy to answer them. But listen, one of us has got to get some relief, because some of the things I'm seeing on YouTube by the other side are absolutely blasphemous statements. And I fear for these people who are defaming the character of God by their blasphemous statements. Well, until next time, may God richly bless you.